Hello and welcome to the Streamcast. This is Hendershott-Kraetzer from the Department of Humanities at Olivet College, and today we're starting the second in a series of talks on features of poetry, focusing this time on the poetic line. For my money, lines are where poetry is distinguished from the other written art forms, because prose can have imagery. Prose can use the variety of sound effects that you can have in prose can have meter and metrical features, and it can use all of the figures of speech that poetry relies on. But what prose doesn't have is the idea of a line the way it exists in poetry. So this is, for me, the distinguishing feature, the thing that makes poems poems. It's also an absolutely fascinating thing to work with. If you are a person who enjoys structure, who enjoys a sense of building things in relationship to other things, and seeing how you can change the meaning of a phrase with the phrase that follows it, and so have this kind of constantly evolving feeling or understanding of writing, then I think you're going to get a big kick out of lines and all the things you can do with them. So that's enough for me yapping about all the wonderful things you can do with lines. Let's get to looking at actually what you can do. So what is line? Most fundamentally, it's a unit of composition in poetry. Another way of thinking about it is a unit to work in. It's a method of making a poem, line by line, brick by brick. Line isn't something you break language into or something a poem is broken into, and it certainly isn't reformatted prose, and most fundamentally, it's not done right in any one right way. One thing I really try to recommend to my writing students is that they don't take a paragraph and break it up and think that they're creating lines. They're making something like a line, but they're not thinking in terms of the line as a thing in and of itself. Lines are very powerful tools, but they exist in and of themselves as well as in relationship to other things. So you shouldn't really think of them as something that's broken up or that's chunked up or that's a fragment of something else. Lines are complete entities all on their own. So how do you use a line? That's a tough question, and there is no one right answer to it. We're going to look at a whole bunch of different ways of thinking about lines, and not any one of them is the right way of doing it. There are lots of right ways to do lines. There are lots of ways you can mess a line up, too. But a lot of it is just purely contextual thinking. The way in which a line works in one poem might not work in another. So it's a pretty sophisticated, nuanced way of dealing with poetry. So what are the elements of a line? There are 5. The length, rate, weight, rhythm, and break. That's length, rate, weight, rhythm, and break. These are not ordinal. You see I put bullet points there. They're not numbered in terms of the most important to least important or least to most. I actually put them this way to try and help people remember the 5 elements. There's a certain rhythm to the way that I arrange these things, both in terms of the sounds and rhymes, to try and help my students remember what the 5 are when I quiz them about these things. Length, rate, weight, rhythm, and break. Length, rate, weight, and rhythm all depend upon your words, your word choices. Those they're word-centered. If you have words, you've got one or the other or multiples of these things. The break is the only one that is not word-oriented, and we're going to look at breaks in and of themselves later on. So, what is length? Length is literally how long, how many syllables the line is. It is the objective measure of poetry. That's one of the reasons for starting with it. It's the easiest one to really wrap your mind around. The line is as long as it is. It's also a subjective measure, which, of course, you're looking at that and thinking, well, how can it be both? How can it be objective and subjective? Well, that's because we don't really know how long is. You can talk about the length of a line, but does that mean it's a long line or a short line? So how long is long? This is really a matter for the individual writer, for the individual poet, for the individual student of poetry to think about. For me, a short line is anything less than 6 syllables. For example, this one by Robert Haight, "It will not stay." That's a short line. A medium length line is anything, for me, from 6 to 8 syllables. You know how, after it rains. That's from Dan Gerber's advice. And a long line is anything greater than 8 syllables. With measured pace, they move in single file. And then a huge long line from Robert Hedden. I spent the winter my father died down in the basement. That's a 13-syllable line. That's a walloping big line. The Greeks didn't write lines that long as a rule. They tended to write in like 12-syllable lines. So that's a beast of a line. You can write whatever length you want, although generally length has different impressions upon readers. Shorter lines tend to feel quicker. They tend to feel lighter. That's not by any means an absolute standard, but the way in which you craft your lines can have a pretty big impact on the way that the ideas in the lines are understood and felt. Here's an example of the way in which you can vary your line lengths for different effects from David Allen Evans. 6 years later, I notice, inside a flock of blackbirds, the Venetian blinds I dusted off for my mother on Saturday mornings, closing, opening them with the pull cord a few times just to watch the outside universe keep blinking. As the flock suddenly rises from November stubble, hovers a few seconds, closing, opening, blinking, before it tilts, then vanishes over a hill. There are all three kind of grades of lines in here. There are short lines, medium lines, and long lines, which gets into the rhythm of a poem, which we're going to be talking about in a subsequent screencast of this. So a poem does not have to have all short lines or all long lines or all medium length lines. Some do. Some have very specific formal requirements that mean they must have lines like that, but they don't have to. So don't get locked into thinking that your lines all have to be the same length or that you are going to be writing a bad poem. When you're building line by line, when you're thinking about line as a unit, the line needs to be as long as it needs to be sometimes, and that's what's going on with this poem, because there is no pre-existing external requirement about how long a particular line has to be. Rate is the pace at which the line reads. So you've got the length of a line, which is how long it is, either short, medium, or long, and then you have the rate, which is how quickly a line actually comes out of your mouth. And you can think about the rate as an internal measure as well, but generally when people are talking about rate, they're talking about oral performance of the thing. It is much more subjective than the length of a line. The reason for that is it depends on the reader. You're listening to me talk. I'm kind of a quick talker, so I'm going to read lines a little more quickly than most people would, although I will slow down when I feel like a line needs to be slowed down. But it also depends on what one thinks of as quick or as slow. My understanding of quick or slow is not going to be the same thing as someone else's understanding of quick or slow. So there's a lot of subjectivity that goes into talking about the rate of a line. So really you're going to have to come down to what you think of as quick or slow and what you want to have going on in your poetry in order to kind of control this aspect of lineation. Rate can be controlled through sounds, the sounds you choose, the length of the line, the diction, the word choice you use, the rhythm, the meter, line breaks. It can be controlled through a lot of different things. Obviously, the length is going to be a factor, but the sounds and the diction are probably two of the biggest factors on the rate of a line, simply because the sounds can, if you've got jumbled up and tangled sounds, they can slow things down, and if diction is causing the reader to encounter words that they are unfamiliar with or that are difficult and challenging to pronounce or to wrap your brain around, that's going to slow a line down, whereas shorter, more familiar words with kind of poppy sounds are going to zip out more quickly from the mouth. Here's an example from Jonathan Green's Untitled. Honored when the butterfly lights on my shoulder. Honored when and on my shoulder for me are slower lines than the butterfly lights, and that's entirely because of the sounds in the lines. Honored when has low, soft vowel sounds and tends to have softer consonant sounds as well. In fact, there's only one really hard consonant in the entire first line, D, and same thing in the third line, the D in shoulder. whereas in the Butterfly Lights has plosives, B's and T's, and high, long vowels, which make the line pop out of the mouth more quickly. So even within a little 3-line stanza like this, you can get different line rates, even within a very similar length lines. Excuse me. So don't be trapped into thinking that a long line is going to be a quick line, or a short line is going to be a quick line, or a long line is going to be a slow line, or anything like that. A lot of it depends upon the sounds, as I said, in combination with each other. Okay, the weight of a line. Weight is how heavy or light a line feels. There you see that word feel, which means it's even more subjective still than talking about weight, than talking about rate, because not only we're talking about heavy and light, which is subjective, but it's the feel of a line, so you're feeling whether something that feels heavy or feels light, so there's a lot of subjectivity that's starting to creep in here. A lot of it depends upon the length of the words in the line and how many heavy or light words there are. So a long line with a lot of light words is going to feel possibly lighter than a short line with a lot of heavy words in it. And again, this is kind of one of the crazy subjective things about this particular aspect of lines. Also, the sounds, diction, and content are going to bear weight on this as well. For example, the Butterfly Lights seems to me like that a very light line. It's not a heavy line at all. Whereas On My Shoulder is going to feel heavier because of the sounds, those lower, heavier sounds. So it's going to slow it down and it's going to make it a little bit heavier. Honored When is going to feel heavier, again, because of the sounds, but also honor is kind of a heavy word. It's got a little meat behind it. It feels like a heavier thing than butterfly, which is a flitty kind of word, whereas honor is kind of a serious word. As I said, short lines can be heavy and long lines can be light. It's a pretty complex matrix we're dealing with. Here's some examples. I see the violent gesticulations and feel, no, not nothing, but in this gentle haze, nothing commensurate. Those, for me, are pretty freaking heavy lines. Violent gesticulations. I mean, one, violent is going to be a heavier word simply because it implies violence. Gesticulations is a heavy word because it just takes a little bit of work to get it out of your mouth. The pacing of the second line, and feel, no, not nothing, but in this, it creates a sense of heaviness, even though there's nothing really heavy in any individual word, although the triple negative, no, not nothing, creates a sense of weight going on there. Gentle haze, nothing commensurate. Low sounds, longer words, polysyllabic, multisyllable, all are creating a lot of weight going on there. Versus, what she remembers is his glistening back in the bath. Those, for me, are much lighter lines, although there is an element of weight. They're not like as light as they possibly could be. The element of weight comes in them from the fact that it's memory, and memory has a certain degree of weight. There's a weightiness to it, as opposed to the lightness of the present or the optimism of looking into the future. There's a degree of speed to it as well, though, from the glottal G and the B's, which kind of pop out of the mouth, and there's kind of a little zippy rhythm, and there's glistening back in the bath. You can say those lines pretty quickly. Gentle haze, nothing commensurate. I don't care how quickly you say that. It's not going to come out as fast as his glistening back in the bath, although they're roughly the same number of syllables. So that takes us through the first part of our presentation on lines. We've looked at length, rate, and weight. What's coming up is we're getting into the more complicated and feature-laden aspects of poetry, but you shouldn't let that scare you off because they're just adding more richness, more things that you can do with your poetry as you increase the amount of tools in your kit or weapons in your arsenal, however it is that you want to think about your writing. Hope to see you again in a few minutes. For now, it's Hendershott-Kraetzer signing off.